I just want to thank Jack and Paul and Nicole for inviting me to come and talk. Well, come to my dining room and talk, I guess. It's so weird. We don't have the right language for this, but I was really happy to be asked to do this talk. We have been working on this suffrage project together for a little less than a year, I guess. I started researching suffrage in 2018, early in the spring. There was a meeting called by the Knox County Library, and that's when I first started doing my research. And by the time their history fair rolled around in August, I had a little mini tour written, and I called it Misbehaving Women. And I don't know if it was the title or the subject matter, but I had more people show up for that tour than any other one I'd ever done. So I decided, okay, I need to make this into a full-length tour. So I was already thinking about it when Paul approached me about working with the History Project on a research project about women's suffrage in Knoxville. So I was really happy to work with them. They're always great. And this was a way bigger subject than I even thought it could be. So you're going to get the highlights tonight. I don't have time to do everything. The subject turned out to be way bigger than even for one tour, but I'm going to just give you a quick overview of things that happened in here in Knoxville. First, I'm going to just introduce you to the national leaders, and then we'll go into the local stuff, which I'll mostly concentrate on. So have here some photos of ladies who were famous in the national movement for suffrage. Of course, we have over here to the left Elizabeth Cady Staunton and Lucretia Mott, and they were the ones responsible for calling the Seneca Falls Convention about women's rights, and that was in 1848, and that's where the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments comes from, which was based on the Declaration of Independence, but it starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So they added some words in, and then they went on to give 11 resolutions of things that needed to be changed to make women truly equal. The 9th one was that women should be able to vote, and that was the most controversial. It barely passed, but that became the cornerstone of the women's suffrage movement. Now, Susan B. Anthony is up here in the center. She is the one that the amendment was named for, but she wasn't at Seneca Falls. She did not meet Stanton until 1851. So she became involved first through the abolition and temperance movements and met Mrs. Staunton, and they became friends and started to work together on suffrage and equal rights for women. She's famous, made a name for herself first by trying to vote in the 1872 presidential election. So she was arrested and fined $100, but she never paid it. She trained this lady down here, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Carrie Chapman Catt would take over for Susan B. Anthony. They had established the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, and when Susan B. Anthony unfortunately died before she ever saw the vote, she died in 1906, but Carrie Chapman Catt took over for her, and she had gotten involved in 1887. She was a teacher and a reporter, and quickly emerged as a leader in the movement. Now in 1915, I'm going to call the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was abbreviated NAWSA, so NAWSA is what I'm going to call. It's not I'm not trying to say NASA with an accent. It's just NAWSA. They started to flounder in 1915 because the organization split, because this young lady over here on the right, Alice Paul, had joined the organization, but she was a child of Quaker parents. They already believed in equal suffrage and equal rights for gender equality. So she had been taken to meetings as a child, and she went to pursue a PhD in social work in England, and that's where she learned of militant protest tactics like picketing and hunger strikes. And when she came back, she could not persuade the members of NAWSA to use these tactics, so she was frustrated and left to form her own party, which she called the National Women's Party. And they were the ones who organized the protests in front of the White House and picketed the White House when Woodrow Wilson was president. Now, and the success of this national movement came after decades of struggle, beginning at the local level. And in Knoxville here, the women of Knoxville began to pursue the, oops, here we are. They began to pursue women's rights in the Market House and the Female Academy, which was later called the East Tennessee Female Institute. And they pursued this subject among clubs in the Women's Building and later the Lyceum, and in that hotbed of independent thought, the public library. So they were talking about this long before the amendment came to Tennessee, and it became Tennessee's historic moment to decide whether to ratify this or not. You know, East Tennessee women have never been known for keeping their opinions to themselves. And we have a fine tradition of misbehaving women in this area. So I like to celebrate their bucking of the status quo. And, you know, there may be buildings downtown today that you walk by and you have no idea that they are part of this story. And just going backwards for some reason. Well, I don't know what's happening here. I need the Ornstein building, and for some reason it jumped way ahead. All right, sorry, having technical difficulties, but there we are. It's normal. So this is the Ornstein building, which is down there at the corner of near Market Square of Clinch and Market. I'm sorry, Union and Market. And this was built in 1905. It was supposed to be our first luxury department store. It was built by a couple that had a German immigrant. His name was Max Arnstein, but it's his wife, Lala, that I want to talk about, because she helped out in the store, but she also was one of our first females to run for office and was successfully elected as Justice of the Peace, which is similar to a county commissioner today, in 1924. And that was the same year that Annie Davis, known as the mother of the Smoky Mountains National Park, and a couple of other women I'll talk about later were elected. And, you know, Annie only served the one term, but Lala continued to serve her district until 1930, and that's when Max retired and they moved to New York City. So she served much longer than Annie did. But all that came later, after decades of struggle. And here in Knoxville, we've made some recent efforts to commemorate that struggle. This is our suffrage statue, which was funded through a statewide effort by the Tennessee Suffrage Coalition. And of course, they had the help of many private donors as well. The sculptor is Alan LaQuire. Now, these three women depicted here represent the three sections of the state, West, Middle, and East Tennessee. And each section was asked to choose the suffragists that they wanted to represent their section. So West Tennessee chose, my cursor, this lady over here to your left is Elizabeth Avery Merriweather, and that was a somewhat controversial choice because she was an author and many of her books defend slavery. Her husband was Minor Merriweather, who with Nathan Bedford Forrest helped found the Ku Klux Klan. So interesting choice. Many of the suffragists began as abolitionists, but Merriweather actually owns a slave, so she did not begin that way. Her husband did fight for the Confederacy, and she was banished herself from the city of Memphis by William Tecumseh Sherman himself, and she never forgave any Yankee for that experience. So but it did lead to her first book, The Refugee. She was asked by Susan B. Anthony to travel along on a lecture tour because she was a supporter of suffrage from the South, and Susan B. Anthony had a Southern tour going, and she wanted a fellow Southerner to go with her. And she was a vivacious and really interesting speaker, so audience responded to her, and she continued to speak. She edited a pro-suffrage paper called The Tablet for part of 1872, and she also, with her sister-in-law, Lead Merriweather, formed the National Women's, one of the first suffrage leagues in Memphis. They formed that in 1889. Now, she continued to publish throughout her long life, ending with her memoirs at 92, I believe. And she defended the idealized version of the Old South to the very end. It's an interesting thing to me. It's hard for us to reconcile her belief in women's rights with her lack of consideration for the civil rights of people of color, but that's not that uncommon in the suffrage movement. And as I began to study this more, I began to realize that a lot of these women were trying to hold on to their place in society and keep white people in charge. Both suffragists and anti-suffragists played the race card whenever they saw it as an advantage. And it's ugly, but that's our history. It's black, white, and every shade of gray. We're going to go to Middle Tennessee now, and this lady here is Ann Dallas Dudley. She was a wealthy upper-class wife from Nashville, and she was a mother. She had 2 small children. She was a beautiful, elegant woman, and she used her appearance and her 2 children to show that the stereotype of a suffragist as a mannish spinster was not true. And so she would be photographed with her children quite often, and she would take them to suffrage events with her. She founded the Nashville Equal Suffrage League and was its first president. And she was also president of the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association. In 1917, she became vice president of NAWSA and worked very closely with Carrie Chapman Catt to formulate the national strategy for ratification. Now, it's very likely, because she traveled quite a bit throughout the state, that she did come to Knoxville. I've searched and searched for some reference to her in suffrage stories, but we had several suffrage events here, and it seems unlikely that she wouldn't have come. So maybe someday I'll be able to find some documentation of a visit to Knoxville. Of course, the lady in the center is our very own East Tennessean Lizzie Crozier French, and she was Knoxville's not-so-secret weapon. She was eloquent and amazingly intelligent, and she started the first movements towards organizing and discussing women's rights in Knoxville. She had a fine education, she had a gift for public speaking, and she began to get attention and support for the cause of women's right to equal treatment as early as the 1880s. She was the most vocal proponent we had of the 19th Amendment and instrumental in the work that went into getting it ratified. We're going to go to this left side is a sketch of the old Crozier home, which was on the corner of Clinch and Gay, where the Farragut Hotel is today. We'll see a picture of that later. And this was where her father's house was. So Lizzie was actually born a block away on the corner of Clinch and Gay, but the family moved here to this house when she was about 2.5 years old. And she was raised here until the family had to leave. Her father took the Confederate side during the Civil War, so until the family had to leave and flee from the Union Army, this is where she lived. Now, when they came back, and they did come back to Knoxville in 1867 after the war was over, they never really got this house back, as far as I can tell. They did not have as much property or as much money as they had had before the war, but still, her father, her education was important enough that he sent her to the convent visitation in Georgetown, then to a private Episcopal school for young women in Columbia, Tennessee, so that she could finish her education. She came back, and in 1872, she married William French, but he died about 18 months later when her son was only 4 months old. And it was at that point that she began to realize that women had no rights. She could not inherit her husband's property. It went to her 4-month-old son. So she decided to start working for property rights and equal treatment of women at an early age, and she began working on that. She had many, many accomplishments throughout her life, so I can't really give all of them, but one of the ones I will talk about later is her reopening of the East Tennessee Female Institute in 1885. She also authored she taught elocution there and taught from a textbook that she had written herself. She also founded in the same year, the Ossory Circle, even though she was too busy with her teaching duties to take on any offices. So Mary Boyce Temple was the first president of the organization, but she was a charter member. Mrs. L.C. French is how the papers usually identified her. It took me a while to catch on to that so that I could find more references on her in the paper. But she organized the first Knoxville chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union also in 1895, and she was president of the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs in 1896, and founded the Tennessee Federation of Women's Educational and Industrial Union the very same year. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. She edited The People, which was a short-lived publication advocating rights for women. And she began the Knoxville Equal Suffrage League in 1910 after raising interest by taking out an ad in the paper saying that she wanted to invite men, women, and anyone interested, whether for, against, or neutral, to come and discuss this idea with her in her home. She argued for equal suffrage at a widely attended debate with Rogersville anti-suffragist and author Annie Riley Hale. So we have Lizzie over here, and I just want to point out that when Lizzie did this debate, she was 62 years old, okay? All the statues and all the busts and all the likenesses of her seem to make her really, really young, like about 30. But her major accomplishments occurred as an older woman. And I like to point that out because we older women are kind of treated like we're over by the time we're 50, but she had really just gotten started when she was in her late 50s and early 60s. Now, Annie Riley Hale is here on the right. She was from Rogersville. As I said, she was a widow of a lawyer. His name was James Richards Hale. She had 3 children with him, and she was very well educated. She actually worked as a mathematics teacher in Washington, D.C., but she was best known as a speaker on various subjects. So by the time she was doing this debate with Lizzie, she was mostly doing speaking tours. She was very critical of Theodore Roosevelt, and her first book was Rooseveltian Fact and Fable, which came out in 1908. And it was very highly praised by his opponents. They loved it. In fact, the Republican Party chairman ordered 4,000 copies because he wanted to give it to everybody. So she followed that up with Bull Moose Trails, which was another critique of Roosevelt in 1912. She began turning her attention already at that point. She had already started turning her attention to fighting women's suffrage. Now, she wrote a book in 1916 called The Eden Sphinx, and she followed up with women's suffrage in 1917. The same year that she debated with Lizzie in 1913 in October, that very same December, she was in front of the Congress arguing against women's suffrage in December of 1913. I do want to, before we leave the 2 of them, I'd like to quote one of my favorite Lizzie quotes. I knew this before I knew where it came from, but it was actually from that debate. And Lizzie opened up her speech. Annie Riley Hale went first, and then Mrs. French took up the reply. And she opened up her speech with, "I wish I could say fellow citizens, but since I am not accepted as a citizen by the government, I must say citizens and fellow servants." This is a picture of the Farragut. That's the same corner that I showed you before where the Imperial Hotel was. The Imperial was really built to enlarge the Hattie House, which was the original hotel on that corner. And the Imperial burned down in 1916, and so it was between, this hotel started to be built in 1917-18, but between that fire at the Imperial and the raising of this building, when this corner was just a burnt out lot, Lizzie gave a speech here. I think this corner was very important to her because it was her childhood home. And so when in 1917, she was in the back seat, the open back seat of a car, and she had them pull up on the corner there, possibly where this car is down there on the corner. And she stood up in the back of the car and began to give an open air speech in support of suffrage. And according to the paper that covered this, they said she was only the second woman to make a suffrage speech in Knoxville and the first to make an open air speech. So I don't know if that's true, but that's certainly what the reporter thought that day. We're going to go just a few blocks away from Farragut. I have both an old and a modern picture here. This is the Ame Logan Temple. It's the Logan Temple Ame Zionist Church. And over here, it's what's there today. So this is on Commerce Street, and this is where Marble Alley Lofts is today. So this was an important location for African-American women in African-American activists in those days. A lot of their meetings were held here. The 15th Amendment, for the first time, tied the right to vote to gender by giving it to Black males. And this caused a split between the national organization and the people supporting the 15th Amendment, like Frederick Douglass. This led to some of the ugly racist rhetoric that you see in some of these suffrage anti-speeches and suffrage speeches, because especially in the South, the suffragists tried to sway white legislators by saying that if they gave women the vote, they would outnumber the black vote and keep the white people in charge. And anti-suffragists were just as likely to play the same card by saying that if they gave women the vote, then black women would cancel out this advantage. So black women had a really hard, fine line that they had to keep to. They had very few rights, fewer than white women. This was the days of segregation and Jim Crow laws. And the Knoxville city government had reorganized into fewer districts, so it kind of effectively eliminated black representation even among the male population. Of course, there were no blacks in county government either. That didn't happen until this century. So black women struggled under an undeserved reputation for immorality and promiscuity. And when the National Women's Party, one of the leaders of that party became Victoria Woodhull, she was sort of the radical wing of the National Women's Party, and she advocated free love. So in a Victorian atmosphere, that was not something that black women could get behind. So they had to be very careful about their about how they represented themselves because of this reputation for promiscuity that they didn't deserve. They were most often victims. And of course, the people who were most often victimizing them were white men, and they were never charged with those crimes. So black women had to kind of band together to overcome the issues faced not just by their race, but by their gender as well. And they've always been active in their churches, but they formed clubs to start promoting the welfare of the community. And the Daughters of Zion formed in 1882 in Knoxville. That was to help each other in need. Also, for a similar mission, the Households of Ruth formed in 1887, and that was for the female family members of the black members of the Black Oddfellows Club. In 1891, the Afro-American League, which was a forerunner of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had their convention right here in Knoxville, and they met at the church here, the Logan Temple, which was the convention was covered by national papers that came out there, and included national known speakers. Some of them were men, like North Carolina orator Joseph C. Price and New York editor T. Thomas Fortune. There was also Knoxville educator, though, Charles Kanzler. His mother, Laura Kanzler, had been our first female black teacher at all, I think. Attorney William Yardley, who ran for governor, one of the first people to run for governor from African-American race, and they were speakers. But one of the few women speakers was the young lady here on the right. This is a younger picture of Ida B. Wells, because she was only about 29, 30 years old when she came to Knoxville. She was not yet famous, but she was becoming known for her newspaper reporting on lynchings in Memphis. And she would later be one of the primary women of color in the national suffrage movement. And she would be one of the few to march in the National Suffrage Parade in DC. They tried to segregate it, and Ida just waited till they came to her corner and just joined right in. So they didn't stop her at that point. Now, there's not a lot about what she said. It just mentions that she spoke of the role of women in the league, and that she assured the audience that the women would be working right alongside the men. Now, this lady on the left is Mary Church Terrell, and she would also visit Knoxville at least twice. And I think I found out how she managed to find out about Knoxville. In 1899, Mrs. Cal Johnson, Mrs. A.S. Jones, and Mrs. Cora Trigg traveled to Chicago to represent East Tennessee at the convention of the National Association of African American Women. And this took place in Chicago, 1899, August 14th through 17th. At that time, Mary Church Terrell was president of that organization. And she was its first president at its founding in 1896, and she continued in that office till 1901. So it's possible that Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Trigg met her at that convention, and that was part of the Knoxville connection. They may have been the ones who invited her to come to Knoxville. However it happened, she came to Knoxville, to Knoxville College in 1909. February 12th, she gave a lecture there that was announced in the paper. And then in October of 1910, she was one of the speakers at Colored Women's Day at the Appalachian Exhibition at Chilhowie Park. None of the papers give any details about her speech, her subject matter, but by then she was very well known as an excellent speaker on a wide range of subjects, including lynching, citizen rights, disenfranchisement of Black voters, promotion of the welfare of her race. So she had joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 and had embraced suffrage as a way for Black women to protect their children and elevate their circumstances. So it's very likely her lectures in Knoxville would include the importance of the vote. And later in 1917, she would join the members of the National Women's Party in picketing the White House. Now we're going to go back in time just a little bit here because I started to evolve a theory about why Knoxville was such a fertile ground for suffragists. A lot of the women in the suffrage movement, you notice, are educated women. And this was a time when most women were not. Many women, even of the upper classes, didn't continue their education past grammar school. East Tennessee, far from being the home of stereotypical illiterate hillbillies, was full of educated men and women. And this is, partly due to the president of the university, but also there were other institutions. The laws of Tennessee did not recognize women as equal to men or give them the same rights. But there were men who recognized the importance of educating women. And in 1811, the leading citizens from Knoxville chartered the Knoxville Female Academy. And this is probably the second building, but the first building was probably about the size of that center building. And this was rebuilt a little bit later, enlarged. Some of the people on the original board are familiar names: Thomas Humes, the builder of the Lamar House, James Park of Park House, Hugh Lawson White, son of James and our future senator, and John Crozier, who was Lizzie Crozier French's grandfather. It would be 1827 before the school began its first session because they had to raise subscriptions and donations, and Crozier was one of the largest monetary donors. He gave $100. Joseph C. Strong, who was also a member of the original board, donated half an acre of land, as did Matthew McClung for the original site, which is probably close to the corner of where Henley and Cumberland meet, where it stops being Main Street. So it was kind of in that area. It changed slightly over the years. They expanded the land and added on to the building. So it's probably, it may even be in part of the street now. If we looked at an old map, we might be able to tell exactly, but it's probably fairly close to where the parking lot of Church Street United Methodist Church is now. The best known principal in the beginning of days of the school was Joseph Estabrook. He was brother-in-law to Perez Dickinson, and he led the school until he became president of East Tennessee College. So he actually became president of what would become University of Tennessee in 1834. And I read a little bit about the curriculum. I find this really interesting. The students were divided into 4 classes, and they weren't taught just reading, writing, and arithmetic. They had chemistry, Roman history, botany, rhetoric, geography, natural philosophy, which is an early form of physics, and even heathen mythology. That's my favorite. Later, they added maps and natural history and penmanship, painting, French, and Latin. So the exams were written and oral, and the young ladies had to do their exams on a circular blackboard, and they were tested at the end of each term on this blackboard in front of not just other students and their parents and teachers, but any member of the public that wanted to come in. So to me, that's giving them some real pressure there. They had to perform in front of an audience at the end of every term and show, that they had actually learned this before they could pass. So talk about your childhood trauma there, folks. that would have had to be rough. Now, after Dr. Estabrook left to go to East Tennessee College, they kind of struggled, the school struggled to replace him. And for a few years, the Holston Conference of the Methodist Church took over the management of the school. And this brought charges of sectarianism from families of students and members of the board. So they had the trustees wrested control back from the conference around 1844, but it looks like they didn't actually get the school started again under their own auspices till about 1846 or 7. And that's when it was renamed the East Tennessee Female Institute. I like to quote their statement of purpose, which was published in the Knoxville Register in February of 1847. It says, "The influence of females on the habits and manners of men has ever been felt and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen and philosophers. In every age of the world, the progress of moral refinement may be distinctly traced by the condition of women. Wherever she has been degraded, ignorance and vice have prevailed. Wherever she has been cultivated and refined, her influence has been powerful in the general progress of knowledge and virtue." So they had some pretty high ideals here. So the school went through a lot of changes, and I'm going to kind of have to cut to the chase because we're running low on time. It did stay open until the Civil War. It was actually still open in 1862, even though we were full of Confederate soldiers by then. But they finally closed it sometime after the spring of 1863, and it was wartime. There were very few families who could afford tuition for their children or take them, afford to send them to school. So the school did reappear after that in 1864. By then, the Confederates had left Knoxville and Ambrose Burnside had taken charge, and they were, in October of 1804, when the next term was advertised, the first anniversary of the bloody Battle of Fort Sanders was approaching. So it was closed for probably about a year and a half. Now, it went through a series of changes. It went back and forth between being a public school and a private school for many, many years. I had been told that it had closed during that time, so I was very surprised to find out that it was open, but the building was mostly being used by the trustees to lease to the city schools for a lot of that time. I did find out that Lizzie Crozier French was not, as I had been told, the first female in charge of that school. There was a Miss E.F. Morgan who was in charge of the school for at least the fall session of 1869 and the spring of 1870. She didn't last long. She was replaced by a male in the following session. Through the rest of its history up until 1885, it was mostly used as a public school. But then there's a really interesting account of a council meeting of the city in 1885. They have been presented by the school with a bill for back rent of $1,000. And they are very upset about this. Alderman Berry, who was, they said, chairman of the school committee, said he had had information that the trustees had made another disposal of the building and asked the city to vacate, and presented the city with a bill of $1,000 in back rent. And the information he had was that this building was already leased to be a private school for young ladies, to replace the public school with a private one, and the trustees had chosen a new principal to lead it, Mrs. Lizzie Crozier French. So that's when Lizzie took over, and she did a wonderful job. She kept it open and got praises every term, end of term exercises, got all kinds of praise and superlatives in the papers. The examinations, by the way, were not as rigorous as they had been in the past, but the young ladies did have to read papers and essays and do recitations and kind of perform at the end of term exercises. There's one nice description of Lizzie from a reporter. It says, "Mrs. L.C. French is at the head of this enterprise, and she is a whole host within herself. She has more pluck and go-aheaditiveness than any little woman we have ever known." I always like to read the descriptions of Lizzie because she's such an important character here. Now, eventually she did lose the school. It was not because she closed it herself, as I was told, but because, this is another surprising thing, there was a little row reported. All the teachers quit and left, and she had to hire new teachers, but she never really told them what the problem was. However, it was not long after that the trustees decided to sell the building, and so it was basically the trustees who closed the school. Lizzie had given her resignation before this happened, and she said she was going to devote more time to her elocution, which she was teaching private classes in elocution and traveling around doing speaking engagements. And also in 1890, she organized and became president of the Knoxville Women's Educational and Industrial Union, which was a club for working women to educate and assist each other in working for their own advancement. So her career as one of Knoxville's most prominent reformers was starting to take off. The Female Academy matriculated lots of ladies that later would be recognizable on the roles of different clubs and different suffrage organizations. But once the school was closed, a lot of ladies clubs had been meeting in the school, and once it was closed, they had to try to find someplace else to meet. They met in each other's homes for a while. The building was used, I think, somewhat after hours for club meetings, but they wanted their own building. And in 1897, they were discussing this, and they found the building they wanted. It was the Women's Building, and it was built by Albert Bauman for the Tennessee State Centennial, but instead of being torn down like the other pavilions, it was brought to Knoxville and put on the corner of Prince and Main Street, which is now part of the Federal Building complex, just basically sort of across, close to the crosswalk that goes across to the city county building, that kind of corner there of the crosswalk and across from the old courthouse. So this became the center of women's activity. All artistic, intellectual, and social activities took place in this building. It was run by women. Betty Tyson was in charge of the board, the committee that ran the building, and she would later be a charter member of the first suffrage union in Knoxville. So she was an active suffragist herself. Ostley Circle had their own room here. The Tuesday Morning Musical Club met here. You see famous names mentioned in programs like Frank Nelson, who was St. John's nationally known organist, and Bertha Roth, who would be the future founder of the Knoxville Symphony. They both performed in the Women's Building. The Nicholson Art League had an exhibition there in 1902. Harriet and Eleanor Wiley, sisters of Catherine Wiley, participated. They had lots of famous speakers. William Jennings Bryan, President McKinley, Admiral Dewey, and Prohibitionist Carrie Nation. So they had, this was a significant part of women's education as well, listening to people who came through and lectured. It unfortunately burned down on Christmas Eve in 1906. They had a lot of artist studios in there. Women were mostly in the building, but they did have some men, and one of them was Jack Mason. R.L. Mason was his real name, Jack was his nickname. And he kind of locked up the building that night. He swore that everything was turned off, but a little bit later, it caught fire and it burned down in less than an hour. The firefighters were there very quickly, but it was made out of varnished pine, so it just burned down very quickly. They later found the remains of a giant firecracker in the back wall. So Christmas Eve in those days, as Jack has probably told you, was a wild holiday, and they were still blowing things up as part of the celebration. Now the next building, with this building gone, the ladies had no place to meet, and they were desperate. They started organizing immediately to replace this building, and they did. In less than a year, they had raised the money to buy this place. And this part right here on the corner, this is on the corner of Cumberland and Walnut, kind of where the parking lot for the post office is now. It's a direct across this street would be the Park House. So this was the William H. Gass home, and they liked it because it was mostly brick and pebble dash, and it was almost fireproof. So naturally that was important to them after losing the women's building like they had. They paid for it by selling stock, and a lot of the 7 clubs put forth the capital stock in this, and they were able to purchase it for $11,500 in 1908, and they allowed the clubs to start meeting while they were renovating. Now the renovation is this part back here. They've added on an auditorium, and this upper part has a open balcony there where they had dances and so forth later. This, again, became the center of all cultural activities in Knoxville. All the clubs met here. Ostley had their own room. They owned most of capital stock in the later years of the Lyceum. So it was a great success, and you again find famous names popping up in programs there. John Clark, who was the flutist who would marry Bertha Walburn and help reform the KSO. Frank Nelson, again, was a performer there, and even Catherine Wiley took a part in a pantomime to raise money to help pay off the building, and to raise money for the Nicholson Art League. So lots of artistic activities went on there, but also suffrage activities. Shortly after it opened, Lizzie gave a lecture series at the Lyceum, and she was highly praised for her use of graphs and charts, visual aids not being a big thing back then, I guess. That's when, and shortly after this successful lecture series, she announced her meeting to form the first suffrage club. And by January 20 29th of 1910, the Knoxville Equal Suffrage League had formed under her leadership. And they, Mrs. Wiley P. Morgan, who was the wife of the editor of the Knoxville Sentinel at the time, was a charter member of this league, and she persuaded her husband to give the league space in the newspaper. Not to be outdone, Captain Rule of the Journal and Tribune offered the league space on his editorial page. So, and he was also very good about letting them announce and report on local suffrage events and activities. So they got support from the local newspapers for their suffrage activities. And a lot of the charter members and officers of Lyceum clubs were regular contributors to the newspapers. Mrs. Cornelius E. Lucky, who was, her maiden name was Julia Sims, she wrote regular articles for the Sentinel. And Sarah Henry Hunt was a president of the suffrage union after Lizzie stepped down. She wrote many, many articles for the Sentinel. Lizzie, of course, wrote for both papers, and she reported on activities all over the state. There was a famous, in the Lyceum in 1920, there was a big meeting to listen to Miss Anita Pulitzer, the legislative secretary of the National Women's Party. And Lizzie was also a speaker. She was reporting on her visit to the 1920 presidential nominee. She'd been chosen to represent East Tennessee as part of this delegation, and she had visited both Governor James Cox and Warren G. Harding, who were the presidential nominees that year. She reported on the interviews, and she was not pleased with Harding's lack of commitment to the cause. They didn't call him the great equivocator for nothing. So, this building remained the center of all kinds of community activities until 1931, when they chose this site for the post office, and it was eventually torn down. Now we're going to go across the street real quickly to the Park House, which is mainly important to the suffrage cause. It's the second oldest house in Knoxville. But during World War I, it was a Red Cross depot, and this building was, the work of the Red Cross was mostly done by women volunteers who folded bandages, knitted socks, caps and scarves for the soldiers. They trained in first aid and nursing, and they raised a lot of money for the war effort through teas and bake sales and selling of homemade items, and even sold war bonds through this building. So this gave the suffragists an answer to those people from the opposite side who said that women shouldn't get the vote because they could not participate in the time of war. And they pointed out, yes, we can participate. This is what we can do. This 1917 was an intense year for suffrage. This is when the pickets of the White House started. And there's a great quote from one of the articles I read: "Political savvy is the ability to tell a bandwagon from a hearse." So all of the major political parties had endorsed the vote for women. And yes, there were 5 major political parties mentioned by the newspapers: Democratic, Republican, Progressive, Prohibition, and Socialist parties. So they had all endorsed suffrage for women. But they still lacked the support of the president, Woodrow Wilson, and that's why they started picketing. Of course, the women were very careful to be nonviolent, but they were still arrested for obstructing the traffic. They started in January, and the arrest started in August. And they were taken to the vermin-infested Occoquan workhouse, which had been closed because it wasn't fit for men to be prisoners there. But their treatment at the Occoquan workhouse, and Alice Paul was one of the prisoners, and she started a hunger strike, and force feeding was added to the punishments then. This would horrify the public, but they had to get the word out. So in late fall of 1917, there was a tour of all through the states, and this lady on your left here is Miss Maud Younger. She was known as the millionaire waitress because she had gone undercover as a waitress to help California waitresses form a labor union. And she booked the Market Hall on the square for her speech. But the city council voted to cancel the contract, saying they had received a letter from local suffragists saying that she was a militant and not part of the mainstream movement. And this is kind of suspicious because Lizzie was promoting this talk, and the local suffragists were all holding events to welcome Miss Younger. So I don't know who these local suffragists they were voting were, but not anybody we would recognize. But Lizzie got Miss Younger a hearing before Judge G.W. Trotter and County Attorney J.G. Johnson, in order to determine if her speech really was seditious. And they made her perform the whole speech. They examined all her documents and news clippings and decided that the speech was harmless and it would be okay for her to deliver it. And Judge Trotter decided they could use his courtroom in the old courthouse to do this. And he set the meeting for that very evening, Tuesday, November 27th, but the anti-suffragists still had somebody in their corner, and that was the sheriff, John L. Calloway, who until a recent administrative change had been in charge of the courthouse building. So when the ladies arrived that evening, he was standing there and had the doors padlocked. He had 8 armed deputies guarding every entrance, and they tried to reason with him. They tried to get him to let them come in. They showed him their letter of permission. Judge Trotter was called, but in spite of everything, he refused to let them in. And Mrs. Younger, seeing the crowd of 500 citizens gathered on the north lawn, announced that the sheriff had the courthouse, but she had the audience. So she began to give her speech from the steps of the courthouse, which you see on the right, and she held her audience spellbound for 45 minutes in an icy November breeze with only a light evening wrap, they said, as protection against the cold. The people listened to her, as I said, wrapped in attention, and at the end, one of them made a joke that they were lucky that the sheriff had closed the courthouse because they wouldn't have all been able to hear her otherwise. And a local doctor called out, "We'll take care of that sheriff at the next election." So I didn't get a chance to see. I think that Sheriff Calloway did lose the next election, and I can't remember for sure if I documented that or not. But her bravery and determination was very much admired by her audience, and the devotion to the cause that all the suffragists showed was felt even by the people who were ambivalent about the question. They felt like the ladies had a right to be heard. So the tide was beginning to turn. We are very low on time, and I want to mention this next lady real quickly. This is Mary Utopia Rothrock, who was probably in the crowd that night because she came to Knoxville in 1916, 1917. She was a very big proponent of the vote and a big proponent of women's rights. She was, of course, our most famous librarian of Lawson McGee Library. And even after the vote was won, she continued to work for equal rights. One of her famous quotes is from a 1930 newspaper article that covered a debate between her and Knoxville Mayor Jack Trent. This was during the Depression, and he wanted women to quit their jobs so unemployed men could have the job. And she said, "You assume your jobless men could take the place of your employed woman, but could they? Society would be more injured by the maladjustment set up by men in women's jobs than by unemployed men. Women get their jobs and hold their jobs because they can do the work better than men. When you deprive women of the possibility of economic independence, you have enslaved them." Mayor Trent had nothing to say to that, according to the newspaper report. So another opponent would complain in a later article that librarian is a dangerous woman and you never know when she's going to break out. So, I'm going to go to the Harry and Feb Burns statue, and we all pretty much know the story of Harry and Feb Burns, so I'm mostly going to concentrate on the statue itself, which was just put in place in 2018. It again was advocated for, and the funds were raised by the Suffrage Coalition, and they worked with the museum. East Tennessee History Museum has the letter that Feb wrote Harry. It was donated there by his heirs to be preserved for posterity. The interesting thing to me about that letter, oh, by the way, Alan LaQuire, again, was the sculptor for this statue as well. The interesting thing to me about that letter is that Feb herself didn't like for people to read it when she was alive. She thought it was too gossipy. So this is her on the left, that's Harry on the right. She was very proud of her son for being the youngest Republican and newest Republican member of the House when the vote came up. She wrote him the letter because she'd been searching the papers. She was a very well-educated woman and thought it was just ridiculous that she couldn't vote because she paid her taxes too. And she'd been searching the papers to find out how he stood. And when she couldn't find anything, she decided she would write the letter. And she asked him to please support the amendment. And as we all know, he did, against the pressure of his mentor, who was, I believe, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Chandler, and he was against the suffrage amendment. But Harry voted as his mother wanted him to, and later was accused of fraud for doing so. But I always like to quote his speech that when he defended himself, it stated his reasons for voting for suffrage, not because he believed it was a matter of justice and his party had asked him to support it, but because his mother had asked him to support it. And a boy should always do what his mother asks. Now, here in Knoxville, the Sentinel rolled out their banner headlines, which were over 6 inches high, and they stated "Suffrage wins," and the letters were made out of the faces of women. So it was really kind of a cool visual effect there. They quoted jubilant reactions from all over. Of course, Lizzie was given space for a celebratory history of her 40 years of work, and hers and other local women during the movement. She announced that they would hold a dinner to celebrate the delegation, the East Tennessee delegation, who had voted for the amendment. And that took place in September 21st of 1920. Now, Tennessee women, I need to mention, already had the right to vote for president and in city elections. That was in 1919. The Rook Amendment passed the Tennessee House and Senate and gave them that right, but they were not able to vote for state offices before this. So. Now, Lizzie would give lectures and continue to use her influence so that women would vote and use their power for good. At the age of 72, she ran for city council, and she was unsuccessful, but she was a very narrow loss. And I think in today's modern election, she might have won. Of course, she lost, but she was ever the gracious hostess. So she held a reception in honor of the women who were elected to office. And this was held in her home at 620 West Cumberland Avenue. Over 100 people attended. The honorees were Annie M. Davis for the state legislature, Lala Block Arnstein, Knox County Court, Mabel Rule, Circuit Court Clerk, Jane Denny, Knox County Election Commission, Mrs. T.P. Miller, Vice President of the Knox County Republican Committee, and Irene K. Heiskell, Democratic Executive Committee for the 2nd District. Jane Denny was a prominent member of the Osley Circle and a former chair of the National War Council during World War I, and she coordinated volunteers at the Red Cross, like I mentioned before. She served only 2 years before being replaced by a new appointee of the Election Committee. Mabel Rule, on the other hand, served till 1930, like Lala, and she lost in a re-election bid to Mrs. Pearl K. Anderson. Mrs. T.P. Miller was a prominent clubwoman as well. She was a volunteer during World War I, and she was president of the Nonpartisan Political League, which is what the Equal Suffrage League evolved in after the Rook Amendment. And she was in charge of registering new female voters in 1919, but she was also a member of the Knoxville Board of Education before being elected to the Republican Committee. These two ladies here, oh, this is Lizzie, I'm sorry. I love this older picture of her in front of the Park House because you can see exactly where she is. These two ladies here are the ones we know most about. On our left is Annie M. Davis. She moved here in 1915. She and her husband fell in love with the Smokies, and others may have been working on the idea of making it a park, but she's credited with coming up, being the first one to vocalize and start working for that. Her husband definitely got the business community behind it. And when elected, she sponsored the legislation to purchase the land from the Little River Lumber Company. And she and Willis, her husband, took the entire legislature to a trip to propose the land, and that's what swayed them to vote for the park. When the bill was signed into law, Tennessee Governor Austin Peay presented her with the pen he had used to sign the bill. Ida was the nickname of Irene Cohn Heiskell, and she was the widow of Sam Heiskell, who was a Knoxville mayor, our most frequently elected Knoxville mayor. He served 5 terms. He died in 1923, and she was elected in 1924 and served the state committee for 5 years. She was a friend of the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, the future Secretary of State and Senator Cordell Hull. She served as election officer on the board of the State Democratic Executive Committee and was vice president of the Knox County Democratic Executive Committee in 1931. Though she suffered from ill health and financial difficulty in her later years, she remained active in the local Democratic Party up until her death at age 67. And I'm not going to talk about her death because I'm just going to hint that she's on one of my ghost tours. So if you want to know more about that, you'll have to do a ghost tour with me sometime. That's a very fast, quick trip through Knoxville suffrage, and I haven't told you half the things I found out and know, but feel free if anybody's still ready to ask questions.
Who were any prominent antis from Knoxville?
Well, I do have a couple names. I don't know for sure. I mean, I wasn't able to find out any prominent Knoxville anti-suffragists. There were, most of the people in Knoxville were kind of ambivalent about it, more or less. There were some ladies that were mentioned when they did the article after the vote went through that said, well, I never thought about it. I don't pay any attention to things like this. They never had anybody say I was against it. They just, all the ladies that weren't for it were like, oh, well, I'm glad if that's what they wanted. If I don't think I'm going to vote myself, you know. As far as I could find, there weren't any real anti-suffragists that traveled to Nashville or anything like that, or did any. The most famous ones were from Monteagle, Josephine Pearson, Annie Riley Hale from Rogersville, and I think there was one more name I'm trying to remember. Let's see. Go back another page here in my notes. Yeah, the wife of the Louisiana governor, Annie Pleasant, she came through East Tennessee, but she wasn't from here. She just came on a lecture tour, and she was a prominent anti-suffragist.
Yeah. Laura, I'd like to add that Annie Riley Hale lived in Knoxville and worked as a school teacher for 6 or 7 years back in the early, like the turn of the century, back late 1890s, early 1900s. And I'd like to point out the supreme irony that her daughter was one of a nationally famous feminist, Ruth Hale. She was a well-known journalist and writer. She was a member of the Algonquin Round Table, the famous one in the 20s in New York. She was one of the longest term members of that group. But she was the daughter of this anti-suffrage.
Yeah, I remember reading when I was looking up Annie. I remember reading a quote from one of the articles said that her daughter tried to undo everything her mother had done.
Yeah. Other questions?
Anybody?
All right. Well, I want to remind everybody that I'm amazed that I learned a lot tonight. I would say I knew probably 40% of what you said, and I've been taking notes about the other stuff. We're putting this together in a printed, usable walking tour, and it's not as pleasant as a tour with you. And do take Laura's Knoxville walking tours anytime, but we will be printing through KHP a suffrage walking tour based on misbehaving women.
And if anybody wants to take misbehaving women, I'll be glad to give it. I'm only doing private tours now, so you just need to go to our website and call us, and we'll set one up for you.
Yeah. And again, I'm going to have a piece about the Knoxville delegation with 3 people whose names I've never heard before: Joe Foster, Ken Anderson, and Joe Wade, who I think should be almost as famous as Harry Byrne, because they did the same thing he did. Any other questions? I want to just call for questions one more time while Laura's here. She's just done an amazing job with research, and she's made all sorts of connections that I didn't even know about. I'd only heard references to the Lyceum and the Women's Building, things like this, and she really brought them to life tonight. All right. Any other questions? Well, thanks very much, Laura. Really.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.